We needed something that challenges and inspires all of us. Something that I think has enough ideas in it that'll last us for the next 10 years.
Definitely worth the wait.
This is the best shape Destiny 2 has been in.
It was a bright and hopeful time. But it didn't last.
Think about how profoundly disappointing Destiny is. That game is maybe 2/3 of a game.
The release of Destiny's Final Shape expansion will mark the end of the franchise's Light and Darkness saga, as well as capping off a decade of Destiny.
The game's 10-year plan is often something touted by both its developers and its players as Destiny's ultimate goal. However, what those 10 years look like now is drastically different from what developer Bungie first envisioned.
Let's take a look at the original design of the franchise and document how that plan quickly unraveled.
Destiny is an apt name for Bungie's magnum opus, considering the studio's history prior to the game's release. In the 90s, the studio made games for the Macintosh, before development on its most recognizable franchise. Bungie would then spend the next decade developing games exclusively for the Xbox in the Halo franchise. Those titles were some of the biggest releases to hit store shelves, back when there were stores that had shelves. But Halo didn't belong to Bungie, it was Microsoft's IP to play with. In the late 2000s, Bungie split off from Microsoft and became independent, and the studio began development on a new IP, Project Tiger, a reference to the Tiger engine, the engine that Halo was built with. To walk away from Halo at the height of its popularity was obviously a massive risk for the studio, but for Bungie, it was time for it to take its destiny into its own hands. The studio began looking for a publishing partner, talking to both Microsoft and Sony, but deals with both companies would have led to Bungie handing over rights to the IP, which for the studio was not something it was willing to do. This deal breaker led Bungie to make a deal with Activision, which agreed to the developers' terms.
It was in this deal that Destiny's 10-year plan first took shape in the form of Bungie's contract with Activision, signed in 2010.
Bungie agreed to release a new Destiny game every other year, starting in 2013 and ending in 2019. Then in subsequent years, starting in 2014 and ending in 2020, the studio agreed to release expansions for the games that preceded them. Initially, Bungie was confident it was going to hit its planned fall 2013 release date, with most of the game's animations, mechanics, and other systems pretty much locked by mid-2013.
There was only one teensy problem: the story.
In the summer of 2013, Bungie leadership was presented with a 2-hour-long supercut of the game's story by its writing team, helmed by Joseph Staten, who led the work on the original Halo trilogy's cinematics. The game's original story focused on the Warmind Rasputin, a supercomputer that could control Earth's defense systems, and the subsequent capture of this AI by an enemy faction, the Hive. The player would have an Obi-Wan-like mentor in the character Osiris, whom they would seek out with the aid of a fellow Guardian, the Crow. This presentation did not go over well. Deemed too dense and linear for the flexible and open design of the game, months before its intended launch, while the lore was kept relatively intact, the plot beats of Stan and his team's story were almost entirely scrapped. As you can imagine, this did not sit well with Stan, and the writer left Bungie shortly after, going over to Microsoft to help lead Xbox Game Studios.
Over the course of the next year, leadership retooled what had already been made and plugged it into a looser narrative that turns the game into a Frankenstein's monster-esque title. Destiny was, as one anonymous developer at Bungie put it, a game written without writers, and boy, did it show in the final product that released in September 2014.
It wasn't just the story that was poorly received, the loot grind, leveling, bugs, and other aspects of the gameplay didn't go over well either. Destiny launched with a 76 on Metacritic, 14 points off from its 90 target, which would have secured Bungie a large bonus from Activision. It seemed that the 10-year plan might have been over before it could even get off the ground. There was a ray of hope in the game's early days, the Vault of Glass, Destiny's first raid that launched a couple of weeks after the game's release. It was an intricate dungeon crawl with multiple puzzles and stages that was tackled by a team of 6 and required precise communication to complete. The Vault of Glass is still beloved by the community to this day, and its quality showed the promise of what Destiny could be. While Bungie wouldn't resolve players' problems with the game overnight, they did get some keen insight from a different game that had been released a few years earlier in a similar state to Destiny, Diablo III. Since both games were published by Activision, leaders on the Diablo III team were able to come in and quickly address where Destiny was failing, particularly when it came to its gameplay loop and making sure players had felt properly rewarded before logging off of a session. Destiny overhauled its random loot generator, which frustrated users by rewarding them mediocre gear after completing the game's tougher experiences, and had the system better favor the player. While the dev team was spending a lot of its time addressing issues with the core Destiny experience, Bungie also had an obligation to produce 2 DLC packs and a larger expansion. The first DLC, The Dark Below, was rebooted mere months before its release in December 2014 due to a lack of available resources, with a small team reportedly crunching on it up until its launch. The response to it was just as lackluster as the response to the main game. The second DLC, House of Wolves, launched in May 2015 and was better received thanks to the inclusion of improved leveling systems and other tweaks that Bungie learned from its chats with the Diablo III team. However, it was still a far cry from where both the studio and players wanted the game to be.
Of course, all of this was putting an enormous amount of pressure on the game's first big expansion, The Taken King. In order to get that release out the door, it had to be scaled back substantially.
The Taken King was initially planned to be a full-priced expansion. It would introduce Europa, a moon of Jupiter, as a new location, and also an extension to Earth with the European Dead Zone. None of that happened. Released in the fall of 2015 for the reduced price of $40, although it did also require the purchase of the previous DLCs priced at $20 each, The Taken King ultimately focused entirely on the Dreadnought, the antagonist Oryx's ship that was initially meant to be the location of the third act of Stanton's original campaign. Retooling the existing work already done for that iteration of the game allowed the team to hit their release target, almost 1 year to the day of Destiny's launch. The Taken King was able to address many of the complaints the players and critics had leveled against the vanilla version of the game. The expansion featured a straightforward story with a tangible main antagonist, missions had more variety, the way the game doled out loot was further improved, keeping track of quests and objectives was much clearer, the list goes on, and the team was rewarded with its most positive reception yet.
While The Taken King managed to make its intended release date, the same could not be said for Destiny's full-on sequel, which was meant to hit the following year in 2016.
Development on a sequel began soon after the release of the first game, but Destiny's tumultuous first year had thrown the developers' plans into complete disarray, and for a time at Bungie, it seemed for several months following the release of Taken King that no one had really any idea what was coming next, or when it was coming. To make matters worse, Destiny had added microtransactions to the game to make it up to Activision for the fact that it clearly wasn't going to be able to deliver on the cadence of releases it had initially agreed to. But these microtransactions had piled on additional complications to Bungie's plate as well, with many feeling that the rewards in the store should have been made rewards in the game itself, in particular as Bungie was charging money for each content expansion. Not to mention that the aging Tiger engine that was being used to develop the game was incredibly inefficient, with minuscule tasks sometimes taking hours or days to be implemented. By early 2016, the decision by Bungie leadership had been made to delay the sequel a year into the fall of 2017, and to release another meaty expansion later in the year to tide players over till then. Released in September of that year for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One only, leaving PS3 and Xbox 360 behind, Rise of Iron was seen as a drop in quality from the previous Taken King expansion. This was largely due to it being another Frankenstein-like creation, cobbled together with pre-existing ideas and assets, featuring less content for the same price.
Now, you might think that Destiny 2 would have given Bungie the opportunity for a clean slate, a chance to avoid duplicating the mistakes of the past. But, much like the game's story, history has a way of repeating itself.
While development on Destiny 2 had begun soon after the first game's release, the title had experienced, effectively, an entire reboot around the time that the decision to delay it was made in early 2016, getting a new game director in Luke Smith. As such, Bungie had found itself, once again, in a similar position to where it was ahead of the launch of the first Destiny, a largely blank slate with only months to fill it in. Bungie reworked some old ideas to help fill in a lot of Destiny 2's gaps, such as the scrapped European Dead Zone from the Taken King and an area known as the Pyramidion, which was initially also going to be a part of that same expansion, although the structure was moved to a new moon, Io, rather than the previously intended location Mars. Speaking of Mars, while there was originally meant to be a lot more connective tissue between Destinies 1 and 2, most of the first game's content didn't carry over to the new title. This included many of the locations and missions, power level, weapons, armor, currencies, etc. In fact, the only thing that actually carried over was the design of player characters, but even then, there were certain stipulations that users had to accomplish in Destiny 1 to unlock that capability. Reception to Destiny 2 was better than Destiny 1 at its launch, but by many it was seen as a step backward from where the first Destiny left off. A lot of the improvements that the team had made on the original game were present, and Bungie addressed a number of additional complaints, such as getting rid of Grimoire cards, the lore blurbs that only existed in the Destiny app, and having events such as raids hosted on its servers rather than a player's console, significantly cutting down on the number of disconnections users would experience. Critics noted that the game featured some of the best level design and gunplay from the franchise to date. However, there was still a lot of issues that critics and players had with the sequel. Destiny 2 had made the time to kill enemies longer, slowing its core gameplay loop down, and that was an aspect that people mostly enjoyed about the series. Abilities, another popular element of the game, had been nerfed. Players also felt like the title was designed to be more accessible to casual players, which was an intentional choice to sell more copies, but Bungie hadn't nailed the balance and ended up alienating many of its hardcore users. This particular issue was exacerbated by a lack of endgame content and fixed roles, meaning guns always had the same stats, which led to only a handful of weapons being viable options for high-level play.
While Destiny 2 showed a lot of promise, the community's patience had kind of run dry. As a result, many felt things were even bleaker than after the release of the first game.
Like the first game, 2 smaller DLC packs released soon after Destiny 2's launch, but neither did anything to assuage players' fears that Destiny would never fulfill its full potential, particularly as they also reused discarded characters and concepts such as Osiris and the War Mines, with procedurally generated level design and retooled raid content helping to pad out the offerings. Destiny 2 needed a big shakeup to win players back. The Taken King moment of Destiny 2 was ironically also the game's first big expansion, Forsaken. Bungie killed off its most iconic character, Cayde 6, a choice that raised the narrative stakes of the franchise, which is where a lot of the praise around Forsaken was given. The expansion added a now beloved new location, the Dreaming City, as well as dungeons, a kind of mini-raid that could be completed by a single fire team. And speaking of raids, the one that accompanied the expansion, The Last Wish, is regarded by many to be the best Destiny has ever had, even to this day. Forsaken also fixed so much under the game's hood. It scrapped fixed roles whilst modifying and improving its weapon perks system, as well as allowing players to have more variety with which weapons they had equipped. The time to kill was decreased and, combined with the game's new subclasses, returned to and elevated upon the sense of power players felt previously that had been diminished at the game's launch. Forsaken was seen as an incredibly successful revamp of Destiny 2, and is still regarded to this day by many as the pinnacle of the franchise. The expansion also completely switched up Destiny's release model. Instead of dumping a bunch of new content once a year, Bungie moved to a seasonal model akin to what live service, at the time newcomer, Fortnite was doing. However, despite Forsaken easily being the most well-received content that Destiny had put out to date, the reception from critics and players didn't translate into a sales number that appeased Activision, and so the publisher looked to exit its contract with Bungie early. In early 2019, Activision dropped out of publishing Destiny 2, with Bungie taking on those responsibilities on top of developing the game. While many were optimistic that Bungie getting away from Activision would lead to a more vibrant and creative game, the truth was that a lot of the funding from Activision was what allowed the developer to make the large strides it did with Forsaken and its subsequent seasons. It was a momentum that Bungie would not be able to keep up without help.
With the Activision contracts now moot, so too was the plan to release additional installments of Destiny. Instead, Bungie would just build upon and expand Destiny 2.
That fall came the game's next big expansion, Shadowkeep, which, in an eerily similar manner to the release of Rise of Iron after The Taken King, was seen as a mixed bag rather than another confident improvement on top of the expansion that released prior to it. Its subsequent seasons were also seen as lackluster in comparison to those that followed Forsaken. Along with Shadowkeep came Destiny 2 New Light, which removed the need to pay for Destiny's base experience, which included content prior to Forspoken. This move was clearly an attempt from Bungie to adapt to the free-to-play model, which was solidifying itself as the business model for the live service genre. Games like Fortnite, which launched in the same year as Destiny 2, flourished thanks to its low barrier to entry. No content, only cosmetics cost users money, making them feel less vital to enjoying the game. While New Light was an effort to acclimate to the changing tides of the industry, the content that players all agreed was the reason to jump into the game still had a cost attached to it, and while new players no longer had to fork over money to play Destiny, New Light did little to help onboard them into a game that was just as dense as ever. The next year, which if you remember was originally meant to be the final year of the developer's 10-year contract with Activision, would be a make or break moment for the game. Of course, that next year brought along the COVID-19 pandemic, which, while presenting an opportunity to get new players into Destiny, since everyone was forced to quarantine, put a massive strain on development, as Bungie, as well as other developers and publishers in the industry, had to pivot to remote work.
Despite that, Bungie took its biggest swing ever that summer by doing something it had never done before: commit to and publicly announce a plan.
The developer announced not one, not two, but 3 expansions that would be released over the following years and would conclude the current arc of storytelling that began with the first game. While most of that storytelling had been cobbled together by disparate ideas over the half a decade prior, the latest expansion, Beyond Light, would begin to take Destiny down a more laid out, better paved road. That November, while Beyond Light didn't reach the highs of Forsaken, there were several aspects critics and players pointed to as promising signs for this new plan, namely the new location Europa, yet another idea initially designed for The Taken King, and new darkness powers, Stasis. Perhaps the most important change of all came to that expansion's subsequent seasons. While prior to Beyond Light, seasons had little narrative nuggets tied to the content they brought along, seasons following Beyond Light made major story advancements previously only seen in the expansions themselves. This gave players an extra incentive to continue logging into the game once the new expansion hype died down.
Unfortunately, most of what anyone could talk about with Beyond Light was another Bungie decision that backfired immensely: vaulted content.
This was primarily done to address the game's ballooning file size, with the more stuff that was being added to the game creating more technical complications for Bungie to have to deal with. As such, much of Destiny's content prior to Beyond Light, including locations, quests, and gear, were put in a vault, with the plan being to regularly rotate content in and out. While this solved a lot of development issues that Destiny was running into, as well as reducing the file size of the game by nearly half for players, this change was very poorly received.
Once again, it felt like it was one step forward, 2 steps back for the franchise.
2022 was another consequential year for Bungie. After jumping out of its deal with Activision 3 years prior, the developer was acquired by PlayStation, another sign that Destiny required tremendous support in order to enact its grand design. The next expansion, The Witch Queen, skipped a fall 2021 release in order to launch in the spring of 2022 and allow the development team to make up for time lost due to COVID. That additional time paid off as The Witch Queen became the game's most pre-ordered expansion and the most acclaimed Destiny release to date, with really only the game's new crafting system seen as a shortcoming. The seasons that would release over the next year following the release of The Witch Queen also received similar praise, continuing momentum into the penultimate expansion in what Bungie was dubbing the Light and Darkness saga.
2023 saw the release of Lightfall. Good news, vaulting expansion content was going away. Yay! Bad news, the expansion was just kind of meh.
Initially envisioned as the saga's final expansion, a fourth expansion, The Final Shape, had been announced when the Witch Queen delay was revealed. This ultimately left players feeling as if Lightfall was a more threadbare, less impactful release, especially in light of how substantial an update the Witch Queen had felt. There was a lot to like about it, players dug the new strand powers, and much welcome additions like loadouts were finally added to the game, but the expansion's narrative and once exciting new planet Neptune disappointed the community. Following Lightfall was more seasons, and while they continued the trend of including important narrative moments, the seasonal model had more than worn out its welcome with players. This was feedback that Bungie had been hearing for a long time, and as such, announced that following The Final Shape, seasons would be replaced by 3 episodes. The episodes, titled Echoes, Revenant, and Heresy, will drop new content all at once every 6 weeks in an act, with 3 acts in a single episode, unlike the seasonal model which would sprinkle a dash of new content week to week. As such, episodes appear to be more like mini expansions than seasons ever were. Of course, we're jumping the gun a bit, as before we get to episodes, we have The Final Shape to look forward to, which will see the Guardians enter the Traveler, reconnect with a resurrected Cade 6, and take on the Witness, wielder of the darkness.
It has been a long road for Destiny fans. Initially, the plan seemed so simple: 4 games and 4 expansions, but as we've seen, that plan had to almost immediately be overhauled.
By all measurements, it's a miracle that we're even getting more from the franchise at all 10 years on from the game's initial release. The fact that The Final Shape launches as close to the 10-year anniversary of the start of the series as it does is primarily a coincidence, and all this has a lot to do with the ambition of Destiny. Today, the market is saturated with live service games, all with their own plans and machinations on how they're going to retain their player bases over the months and years to come, some of which, unfortunately, never get to execute on those visions. When the game launched, almost no other studio was attempting a similar model, which is why Destiny's 10-year plan of 4 games, 4 expansions seemed less ridiculous at the time than it does in hindsight. A lot of the pain points the developer ran into along its journey served as lessons for future games as a service to learn and adapt from, and even then, many still struggle to solve those same issues. Whether the game will be around in another 10 years remains to be seen. But if the past decade has taught us anything, it's that the Destiny community will almost assuredly always be willing to give it a chance. And much like the dichotomy of light and darkness, whatever does come of the series will likely be something that leaves players conflicted but hopeful.